Hey guys, tonight we're heading to ancient Rome, a place famous for aqueducts, legions, and a legal system that kept having to pause and say, wait, someone actually did that. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. In early ancient Rome, crime did not become more immoral after sunset. It simply became more convenient, and one criminal noticed this immediately. Roman streets at night were not romantic. They were pitch dark, uneven, loud in all the wrong ways, and full of people who absolutely did not want to testify in court the next morning. There were no streetlights, no patrols, and no reliable way to identify anyone once the sun went down. If someone robbed you at night, you could describe the experience in detail. The fear, the noise, the emotional damage. But the criminal? That person might as well have been a philosophical concept. Roman law unfortunately loved witnesses. It loved certainty. It loved being able to point at someone and say, you did this. And at night, that became very difficult. One criminal put this together faster than anyone else. He realized that stealing during the day was reckless. People saw you. People remembered you. People enjoyed talking about you in court. But at night, faces dissolved, voices blurred, cloaks became universal disguises. And suddenly, theft stopped being a legal problem and started becoming a paperwork problem. So he waited for darkness. He stole after sunset, slipping through streets where everyone was half asleep and deeply uninterested in heroism. Victims woke up furious, violated, and very specific about what had been taken. But when asked who took it, they offered a tragic shrug. A man, probably, wearing something. Roman judges hated this. The courts could not convict on vibes alone, and Roman law at this stage did not treat nighttime theft as a separate category. Theft was theft. The sun was not legally relevant, which meant this criminal kept walking free over and over again, thanks to darkness doing all the heavy lifting. Eventually, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Theft rates climbed after sunset. Daytime crime stayed manageable. The problem was not crime, it was timing. Rome realized, with growing irritation, that the night itself had become a legal loophole, and Rome does not tolerate loopholes. So lawmakers did what Rome always did when outplayed. They changed the rules. They created harsher penalties specifically for theft committed at night. If you were caught with stolen goods taken after sunset, intent was assumed. Darkness itself became suspicious. Night was no longer neutral. It was basically an accomplice. This law did not exist because stealing was worse at night. It existed because one criminal figured out the courts went blind after dinner. And from that moment on, Roman law began a long tradition of chasing clever people who kept saying the most dangerous sentence in legal history. Technically, I didn't break the law. Rome replied by writing another one. After nighttime theft, Roman lawmakers believed they had restored order. They were wrong, because while they were busy congratulating themselves, another criminal looked up, literally, and realized Rome had forgotten to regulate gravity. In ancient Rome, multi-story apartment buildings known as insulae lined the streets. People lived stacked on top of each other like anxious bread loaves. And from those upper floors, one clever individual discovered a fascinating truth. If you dropped something on someone from above, you hadn't technically assaulted them. At least, not yet. Roman law was very clear about direct violence. Punching someone? Illegal. Stabbing someone? Extremely illegal. But dropping a chamber pot, roof tile, or suspiciously heavy object from a window? That wasn't clearly defined. After all, you hadn't touched the victim. You had merely released an object and allowed fate to handle the rest. This criminal weaponized accidents. He leaned out of windows and balconies and let gravity do the work. Sometimes it was garbage. Sometimes it was construction debris. Sometimes it was whatever happened to be nearby and unpleasantly solid. Pedestrians were injured, goods were damaged, dignity was destroyed. And yet, when brought before a magistrate, the defence was beautifully simple. I dropped it. No intent, no target, just clumsiness. And Roman courts, bound by definitions, struggled. Was it violence? Was it negligence? Or was it just an unfortunate encounter between a Roman citizen and physics? Victims complained constantly. Walking through Rome became a trust exercise. You didn't just watch where you stepped, you watched the sky. Being struck by falling objects became common enough that people began hugging walls or sprinting through narrow streets like participants in an involuntary obstacle course. Eventually, lawmakers noticed something troubling. The same individual appeared repeatedly in complaints, always nearby, always accidentally present, always innocent in court. Rome had a problem. One person had turned architecture into a legal loophole. So Rome responded with a new law. Anyone who threw or dropped objects from a building that injured someone was liable, regardless of intent. It no longer mattered if it was deliberate, careless, or claimed to be accidental. The object fell. Someone suffered. You paid. This law wasn't about safety. It was about humiliation. Rome did not like being outsmarted by someone who treated gravity like an accomplice. And so the law stepped in, not to regulate behaviour, but to say loudly, no, you knew exactly what you were doing. And just like that, Rome learned an important lesson. If the law doesn't mention it, someone absolutely will. In ancient Rome, reputation mattered almost as much as oxygen. You could survive being poor. You could survive being unlucky. But being publicly accused of a crime, that could end your career, your friendships, your political ambitions, and occasionally your will to keep wearing a toga outside. Early Roman law assumed a very optimistic thing about human nature, that people would not accuse others of crimes unless they were telling the truth. This assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for one clever individual to realize how devastating accusations could be, even when completely false. This criminal didn't steal. He didn't stab anyone. He didn't throw chamber pots from balconies. He simply accused people, publicly, loudly, strategically. He accused rivals of crimes they could not immediately disprove: theft, corruption, religious violations, things that required investigation, time, and witnesses. And during that time, the damage was already done. People whispered. Allies distanced themselves. Business partners suddenly became very busy. Even if the accused was eventually cleared, the stain remained. Rome loved procedure, but gossip moved faster. And the best part? At first, there was no punishment for being wrong. If the accusation failed, the accuser shrugged and walked away. No consequences, no accountability, just social destruction delivered legally, efficiently, and with excellent timing. It was character assassination without the mess. Roman courts began to notice a pattern. The same accuser appeared again and again. Different targets, same outcome. The accused suffered. The accuser benefited. And technically, he had done nothing illegal. He had merely spoken. This made Roman magistrates deeply uncomfortable. Rome could tolerate crime. Rome could tolerate corruption. What Rome could not tolerate was someone using the legal system itself as a weapon, especially when that someone kept smiling through proceedings like a man enjoying a very clever joke. So lawmakers responded with a new rule. If you accused someone falsely and could not prove it, you would face punishment. The accuser became legally vulnerable. Reputation warfare suddenly had a cost. This law didn't exist to protect truth. It existed to stop one man from turning Roman justice into a performance art piece. From that point on, accusing someone became risky. The courts were no longer just a stage. They were a trap for anyone too eager to weaponize words. And Rome learned another painful lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous criminal doesn't break the law. He uses it. In ancient Rome, funerals were not quiet, tasteful affairs. They were loud, emotional, public spectacles, and one criminal realized they were also the perfect hiding place. Roman funerals involved crowds, processions, musicians, hired mourners, dramatic wailing, and enough chaos to make accountability politely excuse itself. Everyone was expected to grieve loudly. If you were calm, you looked suspicious. If you were emotional, you blended right in. And if you wanted to commit a crime unnoticed, a funeral was basically a legal invisibility cloak. One clever individual noticed this immediately. He began using funerals as cover, pickpocketing mourners, settling personal grudges, spreading political rumors, even organizing small riots, all while crying dramatically and gesturing toward a coffin. And because funerals were sacred, officials hesitated to intervene. No one wanted to be the magistrate who arrested someone mid-wail and became that guy in Roman society. The criminal understood something brilliant. Funerals were socially untouchable. You could push people, shout accusations, whisper threats, cause disturbances, and if questioned, you simply replied, "I am overwhelmed with grief." Rome, unfortunately, accepted this explanation far longer than it should have. Complaints began to pile up. The same face appeared at multiple funerals, always nearby when trouble started, always loudly mourning people he barely knew, always innocent. The courts struggled. Was it illegal to cause chaos at a funeral? Technically no. Was it immoral? Yes. But Rome didn't legislate morality. It legislated embarrassment. So lawmakers stepped in and did something very Roman. They regulated grief. They introduced laws limiting the size of funeral crowds, the volume of mourning, the number of musicians, and even how much dramatic performance was allowed. Excessive wailing, restricted, massive gatherings, controlled, public displays of grief, suddenly suspicious. This law didn't exist because Romans hated emotion. It existed because one criminal turned funerals into crime scenes with background music. After the law passed, funerals became quieter, more controlled, and far less useful for criminals who relied on chaos and social discomfort as shields. Rome had learned yet another lesson the hard way. If something is sacred, someone will exploit it. And if someone exploits it too well, Rome will regulate it. Grief, like everything else in Rome, was now subject to rules. In ancient Rome, early law had a charmingly optimistic flaw. It punished using poison, but didn't clearly punish having it. And one criminal looked at that gap and thought, that seems like a personal invitation. At first, poison laws were simple. If you poisoned someone, you were punished. Reasonable, sensible, very Roman. But lawmakers hadn't considered the uncomfortable middle ground, the phase where someone is walking around with poison, explaining that they have absolutely no plans, and asking why everyone looks so nervous. This criminal leaned hard into that gap. He carried poison openly. Sometimes he sold it. Sometimes he gave it away. Sometimes he just liked having it nearby like a security blanket for people with questionable hobbies. And when questioned, he delivered the perfect defense. I haven't poisoned anyone. Yet. Legally speaking, that was airtight. Roman officials were deeply unhappy. Poison terrified Rome because it bypassed everything Romans respected. Strength, courage, public confrontation. You didn't see poison coming. It didn't care about rank. It didn't challenge you to a duel. It just quietly ended your career and occasionally your breathing. The idea that someone could legally possess it unsettled everyone with influence, which was exactly the right people to unsettle. The criminal knew this. He exploited the fear without crossing the line. He created suspicion everywhere he went. People avoided him. Rumors spread. Enemies panicked. And still, he walked free, smiling politely. Poison tucked away somewhere inconvenient. Eventually, Roman lawmakers realized the obvious. Waiting until someone actually died was not a great legal strategy. So they did what Rome always did when cornered. They rewrote the rules. New laws criminalized the possession of poison itself. Intent no longer mattered. If you had poison, you were guilty. explanation unnecessary. The logic was simple. If you don't plan to poison someone, why are you carrying poison? This law didn't exist because poisonings increased. It existed because one man made everyone feel like they might be poisoned at any moment. Rome didn't punish poison because it was immoral. Rome punished it because it was terrifying, and terror without legal control was unacceptable. And just like that, Rome learned another lesson. When someone is clever enough to stop one step before the crime, the law will move the line closer. Rome loved order. Rome loved categories. You were a citizen, a slave, a priest, a soldier, a magistrate, preferably something easy to recognize from a distance. Which is exactly why one criminal realized that changing clothes was basically changing legal reality. In ancient Rome, clothing mattered. A lot. A toga wasn't just fashion. It was paperwork you could wear. Put on the right outfit and people treated you differently. Opened doors. Looked away. Assumed authority. And one criminal discovered that if the law respected appearances, appearances could be weaponized. He dressed as a slave when committing crimes that required invisibility. No one questioned slaves. No one remembered slaves. He dressed as a priest when he needed access to restricted spaces. Who questions a priest? He dressed as a woman when it helped him blend into crowds. He dressed as a minor official when he wanted compliance without paperwork. And every time he was caught, the defense was infuriatingly simple. I am wearing clothes. At first, Rome had no response. There was no law against pretending, no statute banning strategic wardrobe choices. After all, how could you regulate clothing without admitting that your entire social system was held together by fabric and confidence? Victims complained. Guards shrugged. Courts stalled. The criminal kept slipping through, changing identities faster than witnesses could keep up. One moment he was a slave, the next a respectable citizen, the next someone you definitely saw before but cannot legally describe. The problem wasn't the disguise. The problem was that Roman law trusted what it could see. Eventually, magistrates noticed a pattern. The same crimes, different descriptions, same outcomes. Someone was manipulating perception itself, and Rome does not like being made to feel gullible. So lawmakers acted. New rules restricted disguises in public spaces, especially those that imitated social classes, religious roles, or official positions. If you dressed to deceive, not entertain, you were now breaking the law. This law didn't exist because Rome hated creativity. It existed because one man proved that identity, in Rome, was disturbingly fragile. After the law passed, clothing stopped being a legal cheat code. Guards became suspicious. Witnesses were encouraged to look past outfits, and Rome learned yet another uncomfortable truth. If your system depends on appearances, someone will eventually change clothes and walk right through it. In ancient Rome, land was everything. Land meant wealth, status, food, power, and the right to look down on your neighbours with confidence. So naturally, Rome assumed that once land boundaries were marked with stones, everyone would politely respect them forever. One criminal read that assumption and smiled. Roman property lines were often marked by boundary stones, heavy markers placed between fields, roads, and estates. These stones were considered sacred, stable, and unquestionably reliable. The law treated them like permanent facts of nature, which is exactly why one very patient individual realized something terrifyingly simple. Stones can be moved, not dramatically, not obviously, just a few inches at a time. One quiet nudge after sunset, another nudge a few weeks later. Slowly, carefully, invisibly, the boundary shifted, and with it, so did the land. The criminal didn't storm fields or tear down fences. That would attract attention. He let time do the work. Over months, even years, the boundary stones migrated, and suddenly he legally owned more land. On paper, everything checked out. The stones were there. The land matched the markers. Anyone questioning it sounded paranoid. Neighbours complained, of course. They felt something was wrong. Their land seemed smaller, their crops closer to the edge. But feelings didn't matter. The stones were the law, and the law was standing exactly where the criminal had placed it. Roman courts struggled. No one had written a law against slowly relocating geography. It wasn't theft in the traditional sense. It wasn't violence. It was landscaping with ambition. Eventually, surveyors were brought in. Priests were consulted. Arguments escalated. And Rome realized it had been humiliated by a man with patience and a strong back. The response was swift and very Roman. Moving boundary stones became a serious crime. Not just illegal, religiously offensive. Boundary stones were placed under divine protection. Tampering with them angered the gods. Punishment escalated from fines to exile, depending on how bold you'd been with your landscaping. This law didn't exist because people were clumsy. It existed because one man treated property law like a puzzle. Rome learned an important lesson. If your legal system trusts physical markers absolutely, someone will eventually pick one up and walk away with half a farm. And from that day on, even rocks were no longer trusted. In ancient Rome, weapons were not unusual. Rome was built by people who believed problems could be solved with discipline, organization, and, when necessary, sharp metal. Outside the city, weapons were expected. Soldiers carried them. Travelers carried them. Even farmers carried them. All perfectly normal. Inside the city, however, things were supposed to be different. Rome liked to imagine itself as civilized, orderly, governed by law, not brute force. And yet, for a long time, there was no clear rule against simply walking around armed. One criminal noticed this immediately. He carried a weapon everywhere, not to attack people directly, of course. That would be illegal. Instead, he carried it for protection. A perfectly reasonable explanation, except that everywhere he went, conflict seemed to erupt. Arguments escalated. People backed down. Fights conveniently stopped just before violence technically occurred. No blows were struck. No blood was spilled. No crime could be proven. And yet everyone felt threatened. This was the genius of it. The criminal understood that Roman law punished action, not intimidation. If you never swung the blade, never stabbed anyone, never officially started the fight, you were clean. You had simply been present. Armed, yes. Aggressive, maybe. But legally innocent. Victims complained that they felt coerced. Officials asked whether the weapon had been used. When the answer was no, the case collapsed. Rome's courts were excellent at punishing violence, and terrible at dealing with the promise of it. As more people adopted this tactic, the city grew tense. Disputes stopped being resolved by debate and started being resolved by who looked more dangerous. Public spaces became silent standoffs. Everyone knew what was happening. No one could legally stop it. Rome did not like this version of itself, so lawmakers stepped in and finally admitted the obvious. A city full of armed people pretending not to threaten each other was not peace. It was just violence waiting for better timing. They passed laws banning the carrying of weapons within the city, except for specific roles and circumstances. Soldiers on duty, guards, and officials were allowed. Everyone else? No swords, no daggers, no purely decorative blades that just happened to be sharpened. This law didn't exist because violence increased. It existed because one criminal proved you could dominate public life without ever breaking the law. Rome learned something uncomfortable. Sometimes the most dangerous act is not the strike, it's the implication. And so the blade stayed outside the walls, side. In ancient Rome liked to believe its elections were dignified affairs. Citizens gathered, votes were cast, the republic functioned. It was all very noble, right up until one criminal realized that the law never actually said you could not buy political loyalty, as long as you were polite about it. This man did not hand out coins in public. That would look suspicious, vulgar, illegal adjacent. Instead, he offered gifts, invitations, favours, a nice dinner, a jug of good wine, perhaps a small token of appreciation for someone's civic enthusiasm. Nothing explicit, nothing written, just generosity. And generosity, inconveniently, was legal. Voters showed up well-fed, slightly tipsy, and deeply grateful. When asked why they voted the way they did, they answered honestly, "He is a very kind man," which, legally speaking, was not a crime. Roman law punished coercion. It punished fraud. It did not punish charm with a budget. The results were impressive. Elections tilted. Alliances shifted. Political careers were built on amphorae of wine and carefully timed favours. And when accusations surfaced, the defence was always flawless. "I did not bribe anyone, I hosted them." Roman officials were furious, but they had a problem. How do you criminalise kindness without admitting your political system can be drunk into submission? At first they tried ignoring it, then they tried moral lectures. Neither worked. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone also knew they could not legally stop it. The Republic was being guided not by debate, but by whoever brought the best refreshments. Eventually, Rome cracked. New laws were introduced explicitly banning the giving of gifts, food, entertainment, or money in connection with voting. Intent mattered now. If generosity happened near an election, it was suspicious. If it happened repeatedly, it was criminal. The law finally admitted what everyone already knew. Wine is not neutral. This law did not exist because Romans suddenly hated generosity. It existed because one criminal proved democracy pairs poorly with free drinks. Rome learned, reluctantly, that influence does not always arrive with threats. Sometimes it arrives smiling, holding a cup, and saying, "Of course, vote however you like." And that, it turns out, was the most dangerous sentence of all. In ancient Rome, inns and taverns were supposed to be simple places. You ate, you drank, you slept. You occasionally woke up missing something small and emotionally important. Nothing unusual. But one criminal realized that these spaces offered something far more valuable than wine or beds: plausible deniability. Roman law treated taverns as neutral ground. People came and went. Strangers mixed freely. Conversations overlapped. Noise covered everything. If something went wrong, it was very hard to say who did what, or whether anyone did anything at all. And one particularly enterprising individual saw opportunity written all over the wine-stained floor. He began using inns as operational headquarters. Thefts were planned there. Deals were made there. Stolen goods were passed quietly from table to table under the polite cover of drunken storytelling. Victims later reported losses, but the response was always the same. "Do you know who took it?" And the answer, predictably, was no. Everyone in the tavern looked equally suspicious, or equally innocent, or equally asleep. Better yet, when questioned, the innkeeper could honestly say, "I provide rooms, I provide food, I do not monitor crimes." Which was technically true. Soon the same pattern emerged across the city. Wherever this criminal frequented, complaints followed. Missing purses, altered contracts, sudden arguments that somehow ended in someone else's financial ruin. Always inside taverns, always surrounded by witnesses who saw nothing useful. Rome hated this, because inns weren't criminals, they were infrastructure, and yet they had become safe houses without trying. The law had accidentally created crime zones, where responsibility dissolved into background noise, so lawmakers intervened. New regulations made innkeepers legally responsible for what happened under their roofs. Theft inside an inn now triggered penalties for the owner. Suspicious activity had to be reported. Guests had to be registered. Taverns became accountable, not just hospitable. This law didn't exist because Rome disliked wine. It existed because one criminal turned hospitality into camouflage. Afterward, inns became quieter, less chaotic, less useful to criminals who relied on crowds and confusion. And Rome learned yet another lesson it kept learning the hard way. If you give people a place where no one is responsible, someone will use it to make sure nothing is traceable. And just like that, even drinking establishments became part of the legal battlefield. In ancient Rome, slavery was legal, regulated, and horrifyingly normal. Which meant Roman law spent an impressive amount of time defining who was enslavable, and shockingly little time defining what happened when someone temporarily borrowed a free person. One criminal noticed this gap and stepped directly into it. He didn't kidnap people forever. That would be obvious, illegal, difficult to defend. Instead, he kidnapped people briefly, just long enough to extract labor, information, favors, or money. Then he released them. No sale, no chains, no permanent ownership, just a very unpleasant weekend. And when dragged before a magistrate, his defense was flawless in its audacity. I did not enslave anyone. I returned them. Roman law blinked. At the time, kidnapping laws were vague, heavily tied to slavery definitions. If someone was not sold, branded, or permanently restrained, the crime became fuzzy. The criminal argued that he had merely detained people, temporarily inconvenienced them, provided an unforgettable experience. Victims were furious. Officials were confused. Lawyers began sweating. This man understood something deeply Roman law had not yet admitted. Temporary control was still control, but the law had no language for it. If you didn't permanently remove someone's freedom, had you actually violated it? The criminal kept pushing this logic. He abducted merchants, travelers, and even low-status citizens, knowing they'd be too embarrassed or powerless to pursue charges. After all, explaining that you were kidnapped but then politely released did not sound heroic. It sounded awkward. Rome could not allow this. Not because Romans suddenly cared about personal liberty, let's be honest, but because free citizens were supposed to be protected assets of the state. If anyone could be grabbed, used, and returned with no consequences, citizenship meant very little. So, lawmakers intervened. New laws clarified that any forced detention of a free citizen, regardless of duration or outcome, was a crime. Intent no longer mattered. Release did not absolve guilt. Temporary kidnapping was now just kidnapping. This law didn't exist because people vanished. It existed because one criminal proved you could steal a person, return them, and still benefit. Rome learned yet another lesson it kept learning too late. Freedom isn't about duration, it's about consent. And just like that, borrowing people became illegal. In ancient Rome, authority was not enforced by badges, uniforms, or photo identification. Authority was enforced by posture, vocabulary, and the unshakable confidence of someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. And one criminal realized that this system was basically begging to be exploited. He didn't forge documents. That would be risky. He didn't claim high office. That would attract attention. Instead, he impersonated minor officials, the administrative middle class of Rome. Tax collectors, clerks, inspectors, the kind of people everyone assumed existed, but no one bothered to verify. He walked into marketplaces, ports, and private homes with a wax tablet, a serious expression, and just enough legal jargon to sound exhausting. He demanded fees, issued warnings, collected temporary fines, and people paid not because they believed him, but because arguing with Roman bureaucracy was worse. Victims later complained, of course, but every case fell apart the same way. Did he say he was a magistrate? No. Did he claim authority from the Senate? Not explicitly. Did he threaten punishment? Not directly. He merely suggested consequences and let imagination do the work. Roman law had a problem. Impersonation wasn't clearly illegal unless you explicitly claimed a title. This man never did. He let assumptions carry him. And Rome, built on assumptions, complied beautifully. The same man appeared again and again. Different districts, same method, same results. Always polite, always official-looking, always innocent. Magistrates were furious, not because people lost money, but because the illusion of order had been hijacked. Rome responded the only way it knew how. New laws criminalized impersonating any official role, even informally. If you acted like an authority figure, demanded compliance, or exploited public trust, you were guilty, whether or not you named a title. Authority became something you had to prove, not just perform. This law didn't exist because Rome hated deception. It existed because one criminal proved that governance collapses when confidence replaces credentials. Rome learned reluctantly that power is not always enforced by force. Sometimes it's enforced by someone saying, "This will be much easier if you cooperate." And from that moment on, looking official stopped being enough. In ancient Rome, contracts were sacred. Written agreements carried enormous weight. If something was written down, sealed and witnessed, it was treated as truth, even if no one fully understood what they had just agreed to. And one criminal saw that trust and immediately sharpened his stylus. This man did not lie in his contracts. That would be illegal. He did something far more effective. He wrote them beautifully. His contracts were long, elegant, and exhausting. They were filled with precise language, conditional clauses, and sentences that seemed to wander off, come back, and then wander off again. People skimmed, people nodded, people signed, and only later did they realize they had agreed to something deeply unfortunate. Merchants found themselves locked into unfair terms they hadn't noticed. Partners discovered hidden obligations buried halfway through a paragraph that looked harmless at first glance. Debtors realized that repayment conditions were technically correct and absolutely devastating. And when they complained, the criminal calmly pointed to the text and said, "It's right there. Roman courts were trapped. The contracts were valid. The language was precise. Witnesses confirmed the signing. The problem wasn't fraud, it was literacy weaponized with intent." At the time, Roman law assumed that if you signed something, you had agreed knowingly. The idea that someone would deliberately construct a contract to confuse, rather than clarify, simply hadn't been taken seriously. This criminal changed that assumption. Cases piled up, different victims, same handwriting, same outcome. Judges began to notice that while the contracts followed the law, they violated its spirit, and more importantly, embarrassed the courts. Rome did not enjoy being embarrassed by grammar. So lawmakers responded. New rules standardized contracts. Certain clauses had to be written clearly. Some terms required explicit explanation. Others were restricted entirely. Ambiguity, once tolerated, became suspicious. The law finally admitted that understanding mattered, not just consent. This law didn't exist because Romans suddenly valued fairness. It existed because one man proved you could legally ruin someone with punctuation. Rome learned another uncomfortable truth. When words become tools of harm, the law must learn to read more carefully. And from that moment on, contracts were no longer just binding. They were expected to be honest enough that a human being could survive them. In ancient Rome, superstition was not a fringe hobby. It was woven directly into daily life. Gods watched everything. Omens mattered. Curses were taken seriously. And one criminal realized that if people believed in magic strongly enough, you didn't need violence at all. You just needed plausible supernatural consequences. This man never attacked his enemies, never threatened them, never broke the law in any physical sense. Instead, he wrote curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with names, accusations, and very specific requests for divine punishment. Then he placed them in public spaces, wells, temples, marketplaces, bathhouses, places people had to visit. And suddenly, panic followed. Targets of the curses grew anxious. Business deals collapsed. People avoided them. Illnesses were blamed on divine anger. Even when nothing actually happened, the psychological damage was already done. Reputation eroded, confidence shattered, and best of all, writing curses was completely legal. Roman law had never anticipated weaponized belief. When questioned, the criminal's defense was flawless. I wrote words. I harmed no one. If the gods act, that is their decision. Magistrates hated this argument, mostly because it was technically correct and spiritually awkward. Rome could not arrest someone for asking Jupiter to ruin a rival's life, especially when Rome itself constantly asked Jupiter for favors. But the situation escalated. Cursed tablets multiplied. People accused each other of divine sabotage. Temples became bulletin boards of hatred etched in lead. Fear spread faster than any actual crime. Rome's public spaces felt hostile, not because of violence, but because everyone suspected the gods had been called in. Rome could not function like this. So lawmakers stepped in and did something very uncomfortable. They regulated superstition. New laws restricted the placement of cursed tablets in public spaces. Certain inscriptions became punishable offences. Religious expression was allowed, but not when it caused public panic or targeted individuals directly. This law didn't exist because Rome stopped believing in curses. It existed because one criminal proved belief itself could be used as a weapon. Rome learned a final, unsettling lesson. If fear works too well, it becomes a public safety issue. And just like that, even the gods were told to mind their paperwork. By now, a pattern should feel uncomfortably obvious. Roman law did not grow from wisdom. It grew from panic. Every rule we've talked about, nighttime theft, falling objects, false accusations, funerals, poison, disguises, boundary stones, weapons, bribery, inns, kidnapping, impersonation, contracts, curses, existed because someone stood at the edge of legality, smiled, and stepped just far enough without falling in. Rome did not invent laws to prevent crime. Rome invented laws to stop being embarrassed. The Romans believed their legal system was rational, complete, and divinely favoured. And for a while it worked, until someone clever enough realised that laws are written by humans, and humans forget things. They forget to define terms. They forget to imagine worst-case scenarios. They forget that someone, somewhere, will ask, "Yes, but what if I do this instead?" And Roman criminals asked that question constantly. They didn't break the law. They read it. They didn't rebel. They complied maliciously. They didn't attack the system. They treated it like a puzzle, and Rome kept losing. What made these criminals dangerous wasn't violence or chaos. It was precision. They understood intent better than lawmakers did. They exploited timing, appearances, assumptions, and human discomfort. They forced magistrates to confront an uncomfortable truth. Law is not about morality. It's about definitions. And definitions can be bent. Each time Rome rewrote the rules, it told on itself. It admitted, quietly, that it hadn't thought far enough ahead, that its laws worked only as long as people behaved normally. And the moment someone didn't, the system cracked. But here's the ironic part. These criminals didn't weaken Roman law. They strengthened it. Every loophole closed made the system more resilient. Every embarrassment forced clarity. Rome became legally sophisticated, not because it was wise, but because it kept getting outplayed. In a strange way, Roman criminals were unpaid consultants, and Rome learned, slowly, painfully, and repeatedly, that the law is never finished. It is always chasing the last clever person who figured out how to stay just inside the lines. That's why Roman law feels so modern. That's why it still echoes today. And that's why every legal code in history carries the fingerprints of someone who once said, "Technically, this is allowed," and ruined everyone's afternoon. The Victorian coal stove sat in the kitchen like an iron monarch, radiating heat, soot, and authority. It was advertised as a triumph of modern engineering: controlled heat, enclosed flames, efficiency. In practice, it was a demanding animal that required constant feeding and punished neglect immediately. Coal did not appear magically inside the stove. Someone, usually a woman or servant, had to haul it in by the bucket, often before breakfast, while yesterday's ash still clung to the floor and lungs. Every morning began with scraping, shoveling, coughing, and the quiet hope that today the stove would cooperate. Unlike earlier open hearths, the coal stove promised precision. Victorian manuals spoke confidently about roasting, simmering, and baking with scientific certainty. The stove itself disagreed. Heat varied wildly depending on coal quality, humidity, chimney mood and how aggressively the fire had been poked. Too much coal turned the oven into a crematorium. Too little meant raw bread and shame. There were no temperature gauges, only instinct, superstition, and burned fingertips. Cooks tested oven heat by thrusting a bare hand inside and counting seconds until pain arrived, an early form of culinary measurement that permanently removed feeling from several fingers. Smoke was an ever-present companion. Chimneys clogged, downdrafts occurred, and on bad days the kitchen filled with thick grey haze. Eyes watered, lungs protested. Meat absorbed the aroma whether it wanted to or not. Everything smelled faintly of coal, including the cook. Windows were opened even in winter, because suffocation was considered worse than frostbite. Dresses brushed against the stove and ignited without warning, turning a domestic chore into a potential obituary. The stove also introduced new dangers disguised as progress. Iron surfaces stayed hot long after the fire died down. Pots were heavier, lids snapped shut, and boiling water was now managed at waist height instead of ground level. Convenient, unless it spilled. Burns were common, accepted, and rarely mentioned. A competent cook was expected to carry scars like badges of experience. Yet despite all this, the coal stove became the unquestioned heart of the Victorian kitchen. Meals depended on it. Schedules revolved around it. When it failed, everything failed with it. The stove was not merely a tool. It was a daily negotiation with heat, smoke, and exhaustion, conducted long before anyone thought cooking should be comfortable. Before refrigeration entered the Victorian imagination, food safety relied heavily on hope, airflow, and a wooden box with wire mesh sides known as the meat safe. These cabinets were meant to keep meat edible for as long as possible while discouraging flies, cats, rats, and curious children. They were usually placed near a window or in a cool pantry, positioned to catch whatever breeze nature felt generous enough to provide. Freshness, in this system, was not guaranteed. It was negotiated hourly. The theory was simple. Air circulation slowed decay. Shade reduced heat. Mesh kept insects out. In reality, flies were resourceful, bacteria invisible, and Victorian summers merciless. Meat hung on hooks or rested on stone shelves, slowly changing colour and aroma as the day progressed. Cooks inspected it constantly, sniffing, poking, trimming suspicious edges, and reassuring themselves that boiling would kill whatever was wrong with it. This belief carried immense confidence and only occasional consequences. Salt, vinegar, and spices were used generously, not always for flavour, but as camouflage. A heavily spiced stew could hide a great many sins. When meat began to turn, the solution was not disposal, it was transformation. Yesterday's roast became today's hash, tomorrow's pie, and eventually a soup that simmered long enough to frighten bacteria into surrender. Waste was unacceptable. Illness was unfortunate but tolerated. The meat safe also represented class distinction. Wealthier households owned larger cabinets, sometimes lined with zinc or marble, and could afford ice deliveries during warmer months. Poorer families relied on basic wooden safes or simple hooks near windows, praying for cold nights. In urban areas, soot settled onto exposed food, adding a faint industrial seasoning that no cookbook mentioned. Despite its shortcomings, the meat safe was treated as a scientific improvement over previous methods. It looked modern. It had structure. It suggested control over decay, even if that control was mostly imagined. Victorian households took pride in their safes, scrubbing shelves and tightening mesh as though cleanliness alone could stop time. The danger lay in the illusion of safety. Meat looked intact long after it became hazardous. Smell was unreliable. Cooking masked problems until it was too late. Food poisoning was common, rarely diagnosed, and often blamed on bad air or weak constitutions. Still, the meat safe endured, quietly hosting meals that balanced nourishment and risk. It was refrigeration's awkward ancestor, earnest, inadequate, and absolutely convinced it was doing its best. The arrival of the icebox was hailed as a minor miracle in Victorian kitchens. At last, food could be kept cool on purpose, rather than by luck. This wooden cabinet, lined with tin or zinc and insulated with sawdust or cork, promised freshness through cold, real cold, delivered in the form of massive ice blocks. Of course, the miracle came with conditions, schedules, and back pain. Ice did not appear automatically. It arrived via the iceman, who hauled slabs harvested from frozen lakes in winter and stored in ice houses until summer. These blocks were heavy, wet, and prone to dripping across kitchen floors. The icebox demanded regular refilling, and timing mattered. Too late, and the interior warmed into a damp compromise. Too early, and melting turned the lower compartment into a swamp. Managing cold became a daily responsibility rather than a passive benefit. Food storage inside the icebox was strategic. Milk went near the ice but not too close. Butter needed firmness without freezing. Meat sat on shelves designed to catch drips because nothing spoiled an appetite faster than yesterday's juices pooling under today's leftovers. Cross-contamination was constant, though unnamed. Everything shared the same air, the same moisture, and often the same fate. Cleanliness was theoretically important. In practice, iceboxes were rarely as sanitary as advertised. Meltwater had to be drained manually, and neglect turned it into a breeding ground for odours and bacteria. Tin linings dented and cracked. Wooden frames absorbed smells permanently. Scrubbing helped, but the scent of old fish had a stubborn memory. Still, the presence of cold inspired confidence, sometimes unjustified. The icebox also reinforced social boundaries. Regular ice delivery cost money. Wealthier households enjoyed consistent cold, while poorer families stretched a single block for days, rationing chill like a luxury. In extreme heat, ice was diverted to drinks or sick rooms, leaving food to fend for itself. Priorities were clear. Despite its flaws, the icebox changed how Victorians thought about food. Freshness became something that could be extended, not merely endured. Leftovers were safer, milk lasted longer, and certain illnesses became less common, though nobody quite understood why. The icebox did not eliminate danger, it postponed it. Cold, it turned out, was powerful but demanding. The icebox offered control over decay, but only to households willing to plan around melting water, delivery schedules, and the slow, unstoppable drip, reminding everyone that progress, like ice, never lasted as long as promised. Victorian kitchens proudly welcomed mechanical grinders as symbols of modern efficiency. These hand-cranked devices promised to save time, standardize food, and reduce the sheer physical punishment of preparation. Meat grinders, spice mills, and mincers appeared in catalogues with confident illustrations of calm women turning handles effortlessly. Reality involved far more resistance, sweat, and occasional blood. The grinder was usually bolted to a table edge with a heavy clamp, transforming furniture into industrial equipment. Meat had to be trimmed carefully because sinew jammed gears without mercy. When the handle stopped moving, it did not pause politely. It fought back. Cooks leaned into the crank with their full weight, developing forearms that would have impressed a dock worker. Children were sometimes enlisted to turn the handle, their small arms perfectly sized for repetitive labour. Cleaning the grinder was an ordeal no one enjoyed. Bits of meat lodged deep inside threaded chambers, refusing to dislodge without tools, boiling water, or language not suitable for polite company. If not cleaned thoroughly, yesterday's residue became today's flavour. Rust formed quickly, especially in humid kitchens, turning shiny progress into orange decay. Many households accepted this as normal. Mechanical grinders also introduced new risks. Fingers slipped, sleeves caught, hair brushed too close to exposed gears. Minor injuries were common and rarely documented. Manuals warned vaguely about caution, while assuming the user possessed unlimited attentiveness. The grinder did not stop for pain. It simply continued its task. Yet these machines changed Victorian cooking profoundly. Minced meat enabled new dishes, sausages, meatballs, rissoles, stretching smaller portions to feed larger families. Tough cuts became manageable. Spices could be freshly ground, enhancing flavor and masking less than fresh ingredients. Uniform texture became fashionable, associated with refinement and control. There was also a psychological shift. Grinding turned food into something processed, no longer recognizably animal. This distance made meat more acceptable to increasingly urban households uncomfortable with slaughter. Machinery stood between the cook and the creature, which was considered progress of the highest order. Despite the labor and danger, grinders stayed. They represented effort directed toward efficiency, pain justified by output. Victorian kitchens were not becoming gentler. They were becoming busier, louder, and more mechanical. The grinder was not a convenience. It was a small factory installed at the table, reminding cooks that modern meals were built one crank, one sore wrist, and occasionally one bandaged finger at a time. As gas lines crept into Victorian cities, kitchens gained a new and unsettling innovation: gas-powered light and eventually gas cooking. Compared to coal, gas was clean, fast, and modern. It required no hauling, no ash removal, and far less patience. Turn a valve, strike a match, and fire appeared obediently. For a society obsessed with progress, this felt revolutionary. It was also quietly dangerous. Gas stoves heated instantly, which thrilled cooks accustomed to waiting for coal fires to behave. Sauces could be adjusted mid-cook. Water boiled on demand. Kitchens became brighter, especially at night, extending working hours without reliance on candles or oil lamps. Productivity soared. So did exhaustion. The kitchen, once bound to daylight, now operated whenever needed, whether the cook liked it or not. The danger lay in what could not be seen. Gas leaks were common, often caused by faulty pipes, loose fittings, or valves left slightly open. The smell was not always strong enough to warn of accumulation, and ventilation was poor. Kitchens filled with fumes that caused headaches, dizziness, and nausea, symptoms blamed on fatigue rather than poisoning. Carbon monoxide had no name yet, only consequences. Explosions were rare but memorable. Newspapers reported kitchens blown apart by a single spark, turning meals into rubble. More often, the damage was slow and internal. Prolonged exposure weakened health, especially among servants who spent long hours near burners. Gas was praised as clean because it left no soot, ignoring the invisible residue it left in lungs. Gas also introduced a new relationship with fire. Coal fires burned steadily, visibly. Gas flames were quiet, almost polite, flickering blue with deceptive calm. This encouraged complacency. Pots boiled over, flames extinguished silently, and gas continued flowing. Many households learned safety only after near disasters. Despite the risks, gas spread rapidly. It symbolized urban sophistication and scientific mastery. Manuals offered advice, mostly optimistic, assuring readers that proper use eliminated danger. Proper use, unfortunately, depended on infrastructure still learning how not to kill people. In Victorian kitchens, gas represented the future arriving before safety caught up. It made cooking faster, kitchens brighter, and meals more controllable. It also introduced a threat that could not be swept away or smelled reliably. Progress, once again, came wrapped in convenience and risk, with cooks breathing deeply and hoping the invisible would remain harmless long enough to finish dinner. Victorian kitchens increasingly embraced water as a controlled force, not just a necessity hauled in buckets. Indoor plumbing, where available, transformed cooking by introducing taps, drains, and a new relationship with cleanliness. Water could now be summoned rather than fetched, boiled rather than conserved, and discarded without ceremony. This felt modern. It was also exhausting in new ways. Running water encouraged frequent washing of hands, tools, vegetables, and surfaces. Victorian manuals praised cleanliness as moral virtue and scientific necessity, even as germ theory remained only partially understood. Kitchens became wetter places. Floors stayed damp. Steam lingered in the air. Combined with coal or gas heat, this created a stifling environment where cooks worked in constant humidity, sweat mixing freely with soap and scalding water. Steam became both tool and hazard. Boiling pots released clouds that fogged windows and lungs alike. Lids slipped. Kettles screamed. Scalds were common and expected. Burns from hot water were considered less dramatic than fire burns, which did nothing to reduce their severity. Water was safer, they believed, because it was familiar. Plumbing also introduced hidden problems. Pipes froze in winter, burst without warning, or leaked slowly into walls and floors. Contaminated water supplies caused illness that appeared unrelated to the kitchen, confusing households who believed cleanliness alone guaranteed safety. Cooks were blamed for outcomes they could not control. New technologies accompanied water's rise. Steamers, double boilers, and water baths promised gentle cooking and nutritional preservation. These methods required constant attention and precision. Timing mattered. Water levels had to be maintained. Neglect resulted in scorched pots or evaporated baths that defeated the purpose entirely. Cooking became a technical skill demanding vigilance rather than intuition. The presence of water also reshaped kitchen layouts. Sinks became central fixtures. Workflows changed. Efficiency improved for those trained to manage it, while others found themselves overwhelmed by maintenance. More tools meant more cleaning. More cleaning meant more labour, often performed late into the night. Victorian kitchens, in embracing water and steam, moved closer to modern culinary science. Food was boiled, blanched, and sterilised with increasing confidence. Yet the promise of safety often outpaced understanding. Water could cleanse or contaminate, nourish or scald. The kitchen became a laboratory without safeguards, where progress flowed freely from the tap, soaking floors, lungs, and lives alike. As Victorian kitchens filled with new tools and technologies, storage became a science of survival. Shelves, drawers, and cupboards multiplied, each assigned a specific role in the fight against rot, insects, and disorder. Nothing could simply be left out. Everything needed a place, preferably one that delayed decay long enough to make the effort worthwhile. Pantries were carefully positioned on the coolest side of the house, away from direct sunlight. Shelving was often stone or marble, believed to discourage pests and absorb cold. Wooden shelves persisted despite their tendency to warp, crack, and harbour smells that never fully left. Flour absorbed dampness, sugar hardened into bricks. Tea took on the personality of whatever lived nearby. Storage was less about preservation and more about managing inevitable decline. Containers grew more specialised. Tin boxes for dry goods, glass jars for preserves, ceramic crocks for fats and pickles. Each came with rules. Tin rusted, glass shattered, ceramic chipped. Labels were handwritten, optimistic, and frequently wrong. Households relied on memory to track age, freshness, and risk. Mistakes were common. Rodents treated storage as an invitation. Wire screens, traps, and elevated shelving slowed them down, but never truly excluded them. Insects arrived regardless. Flour weevils were tolerated. Ants were negotiated with. Mould was scraped off if it looked manageable. Entire systems existed to decide when food crossed the invisible line from acceptable to dangerous, and those decisions varied wildly between households. Order itself became a moral value. A well-organised pantry signalled discipline, competence, and respectability. Manuals insisted that chaos led to waste and illness. In reality, disorder often resulted from exhaustion rather than neglect. Maintaining perfect storage required constant vigilance, daily inspections, and regular reorganisation, labour that fell almost entirely on women and servants. The irony was that increased storage options encouraged accumulation. More shelves meant more food kept longer, increasing the chance of spoilage rather than preventing it. Leftovers lingered. Ingredients aged quietly. Smells blended into a permanent background note of almost fine. Victorian storage systems reflected a society trying to control nature indoors. Decay was slowed, catalogued, and managed, but never defeated. Every shelf, jar, and drawer represented effort spent postponing loss. The kitchen became not just a place of preparation, but a battlefield where order confronted entropy daily, and entropy usually won, just slowly enough to keep everyone hopeful. Victorian kitchen technology was frequently advertised as labour-saving, efficient, and modern. In practice, it often did the opposite. Each new device reduced one type of effort while quietly creating several more. Coal stoves needed constant tending. Iceboxes demanded monitoring. Grinders required strength. Storage systems required organisation. None of this eliminated labour. It redistributed it, expanded it, and hid it behind polished metal and instruction manuals. Middle and upper-class households relied heavily on servants to operate this machinery of progress. Cooks, scullery maids, and kitchen maids formed a hierarchy built around exhaustion. The cook managed timing and technique. The scullery maid handled washing, scrubbing, and ash removal. The kitchen maid fetched water, cleaned surfaces, and absorbed overflow tasks. Technology increased specialization, not leisure. For households without servants, the burden was worse. Middle-class women were expected to master complex systems alone, performing skilled labor while maintaining the illusion of domestic ease. Instruction manuals promised order and control but rarely acknowledged fatigue. Efficiency assumed endless energy and flawless attention. Working conditions were harsh. Kitchens were hot, smoky, damp, and loud. Long hours bent over sinks or stoves took a physical toll. Burns, cuts, respiratory issues, and chronic pain were accepted as part of competence. Complaints were framed as weakness. Success meant keeping everything running without incident day after day. The myth of efficiency served social comfort. Technology allowed households to feel progressive without confronting the human cost behind meals. Well-prepared food became proof that systems were working, even if the people operating them were not. The kitchen ran smoothly, therefore all was well. Ironically, increased complexity reduced resilience. When a device failed, chaos followed. A broken gas line, melted ice, or jammed grinder disrupted the entire system. Knowledge became specialized, dependent on experience rather than instinct. Losing a skilled cook meant losing operational continuity. Victorian kitchen technology created an environment that looked modern and scientific, but functioned through relentless human input. Machines did not replace labor, they disciplined it. The kitchen became a controlled space where efficiency was measured not by comfort or safety, but by output achieved regardless of strain. Progress, once again, was built on the backs of those expected not to complain. By the late Victorian era, the kitchen had transformed into a space that would have looked astonishing to earlier generations. Coal stoves roared with managed fire. Iceboxes promised freshness. Gas lights pushed back the night. Mechanical tools hummed and clanked. Water flowed at will. On paper, cooking had become scientific, rational, and modern. In reality, it had become louder, hotter, and far more dangerous. The Victorian kitchen was not a place of comfort. It was a workplace shaped by heat, smoke, steam, and constant risk. Burns were common. Illnesses were misunderstood. Fatigue was invisible. Technology made meals more reliable, but the process more punishing. Each innovation solved one problem while introducing two more. Cleanliness improved, but contamination became subtle. Fire was controlled, but explosions occurred. Cold preserved food, but only temporarily. Yet these kitchens mattered deeply. They laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Modern appliances evolved directly from Victorian struggles, thermostats replacing guesswork, refrigeration eliminating rot, electric motors removing muscle from the equation. The suffering embedded in early technology taught designers what not to repeat. Victorian cooks did not see themselves as pioneers. They were simply trying to get dinner on the table without disaster. Their scars, routines, and improvisations quietly shaped culinary modernity. Efficiency was learned through failure. Safety was learned through loss. Comfort came last. What survives today is the myth that progress made cooking easier overnight. The truth is slower and messier. Victorian kitchen technology dragged domestic life into the industrial age, one coal shovel, ice block, and aching wrist at a time. It promised control over nature and partially delivered at a cost paid in smoke-filled lungs and burned hands. The modern kitchen owes its calm hum and predictable warmth to a century of trial by fire. Victorian kitchens were the testing ground, exhausting, hazardous, and relentless. Progress was not gentle. It was earned the hard way, and every quiet modern meal carries the echo of that clatter, heat, and unspoken endurance. When Alexander first stepped into the Persian heartland, he did so wearing the visual language of a Macedonian king. Practical boots, a short cloak, and the air of a man who slept near his soldiers. Macedonian royalty prided itself on toughness. Kings drank the same wine as their men, fought in the front ranks, and avoided anything that smelled too much like luxury. Excess, in Macedonian eyes, was a Persian weakness, a softening agent that explained why the empire had fallen so quickly. Persia immediately challenged that belief. The palaces Alexander entered were not merely large, they were theatrical. Columns rose like forests of stone. Walls glittered with gold leaf. Floors were polished to mirror brightness. Servants moved silently, trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken. Clothing shimmered. Scents hung in the air. Incense, oils, perfumes unknown in the Macedonian camps. This was power expressed through abundance, not austerity. At first, Alexander treated Persian luxury like captured treasure rather than a lifestyle. He distributed gold to his troops, rewarded officers, and kept up appearances as the same hard-driving king who had crossed Asia Minor on foot. But exposure works quietly. Day after day, Alexander lived inside Persian spaces, attended Persian banquets, and observed Persian court rituals. These were not random indulgences. They were systems, carefully designed ways of projecting authority and divine favour. Persian kings did not simply rule, they were staged. Their clothing mattered, their posture mattered, their distance from common men mattered. Alexander, who already believed himself descended from heroes and gods, began to recognize the appeal. Macedonian kings earned loyalty through camaraderie. Persian kings commanded it through spectacle. The shift did not happen overnight. Alexander experimented cautiously. He reclined on couches instead of sitting upright. He wore finer fabrics at court while maintaining military dress in public. He adopted Persian furniture and ceremonial customs while insisting he remained Macedonian at heart. Each choice was small, defensible, and incremental. To Alexander, this was adaptation, not betrayal. He believed conquest required understanding the conquered. To rule Persia, one had to look like a Persian king. Power, after all, depended as much on perception as on force. To his Macedonian companions, however, something unsettling had begun. Their king still fought bravely and led campaigns, but he was also learning to enjoy silk, ceremony, and distance. The man who mocked Persian excess was now standing inside it, measuring himself against it, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, deciding that it suited him. The first visible sign that Alexander was changing did not come from laws or proclamations, but from clothing. Persian garments were not simply decorative, they were political tools. Silk robes, embroidered tunics, and layered fabrics communicated status instantly. A man's position could be read before he spoke. Macedonian dress, by contrast, emphasized equality among warriors. You dressed like your companions because you were supposed to bleed beside them. Alexander began wearing Persian-style robes during court occasions. Not constantly, and not in the field, but enough to make the message unavoidable. Silk caught the light. Gold thread glimmered with movement. The king no longer looked like the first among equals. He looked elevated. This was intentional. Persian subjects expected their ruler to appear distant, almost unapproachable. Familiarity weakened authority. The diadem mattered even more. In Macedonia, headgear was functional. In Persia, The diadem symbolized royal legitimacy, divine favor, and continuity with the Achaemenid kings. When Alexander placed it on his head, he was not playing dress-up. He was claiming inheritance. He was telling Persian elites that the empire had not ended. It had simply changed hands. To Macedonian eyes, this was alarming. The diadem looked suspiciously like a crown, and crowns implied separation. Alexander had grown up sharing meals, stories, and dangers with his companions. Now he was dressing like the very kings they had been taught to despise. Some interpreted this as arrogance. Others saw it as weakness, the conqueror seduced by the conquered. Alexander saw something else entirely. He understood that empires survive by symbols as much as swords. Persian officials, administrators, and nobles recognized legitimacy through appearance. Without it, resistance simmered quietly. By adopting Persian dress, Alexander believed he was stabilizing his rule, reducing rebellion, and signaling continuity rather than rupture. The problem was that symbols speak to multiple audiences at once. What reassured Persians unsettled Macedonians. Clothing became a battlefield. Each robe, each jewel, each ceremonial gesture widened the psychological distance between Alexander and the men who had followed him since youth. Alexander did not abandon Macedonian customs. He compartmentalized them. Military life remained rough and familiar. Court life became increasingly Persian. He believed he could inhabit both worlds without conflict. But identity does not like compartments. As silk replaced wool and diadems replaced helmets in certain spaces, the language of power shifted. Alexander was no longer merely conquering Persia. He was learning how to look like its king, and in doing so, redefining what kind of ruler he intended to be. Clothing unsettled the Macedonians, but ceremony nearly broke them. Among the most controversial Persian customs Alexander attempted to introduce was proskynesis, a ritual act of bowing or prostration before the king. In the Persian world, this gesture was not worship. It was hierarchy made visible. Subjects bowed according to rank. Only the gods received full prostration. To Persians, it was polite, expected, and politically neutral. To Macedonians, it was intolerable. Macedonian culture drew a sharp line between gods and men. Kings were powerful, but they were still human. Bowing low before another man implied submission bordering on divinity. The idea of kneeling before Alexander, a companion they had drunk with, fought beside, and occasionally argued with, felt humiliating. Worse, it felt sacrilegious. Alexander did not impose proskynesis immediately or universally. He experimented. Court gatherings became tests. Persian nobles performed the ritual naturally. Macedonians hesitated, froze, or refused outright. The room filled with tension. Alexander watched closely, noting who complied, who resisted, and who laughed nervously as if humor might diffuse the moment. From Alexander's perspective, proskynesis solved a real problem. He now ruled over vast Persian populations who expected visible hierarchy. Macedonian informality confused them. If he rejected Persian ceremony entirely, he risked undermining his authority in the eyes of the very people he needed to govern. The ritual was not about ego. It was about administrative cohesion. But rituals are emotional before they are logical. Macedonian officers saw the move as betrayal. They had followed Alexander as a leader, not a god-king. Introducing proskynesis suggested he no longer viewed them as equals. It suggested that Persian ways were replacing Macedonian values rather than complementing them. Resistance was open and dangerous. Some officers refused publicly. Others complied stiffly, their resentment carefully masked. A few spoke out, reminding Alexander that Macedonian loyalty was earned through shared hardship, not enforced by ceremony. Alexander listened, sometimes, but his patience thinned. The failure of proskynesis revealed the core tension of Alexander's rule. He wanted to be both Macedonian king and Persian emperor. Each role demanded different performances of power. One prized closeness, the other demanded distance. In trying to blend them, Alexander discovered the limits of obedience. His authority could conquer cities, but reshaping identity was harder. Ceremony, he learned, was not a minor detail. It was a fault line, and it ran straight through his empire. If proskynesis strained loyalty in public, Persian banquets tested it in private. Macedonian feasts had always been loud, boisterous, and communal. Men drank heavily, argued freely, and sometimes left with bruises as souvenirs. Persian banquets, by contrast, were performances. Food arrived in endless courses. Wine flowed more delicately, often mixed with perfumes and spices. Musicians, dancers, and servants transformed meals into rituals of abundance. Alexander embraced these banquets with enthusiasm. Reclining on couches, surrounded by gold vessels and silk cushions, he participated fully in Persian court life. To Persians, this was proper behavior for a king. To Macedonians, it looked like indulgence bordering on decadence. The sensory overload was impossible to ignore. Incense burned constantly, saturating the air. Oils were poured over hands and hair. Clothing absorbed scent, until the king himself carried the aroma of the court. Macedonian soldiers, hardened by campaign life, found this unsettling. Kings, in their worldview, smelled like sweat and iron, not myrrh and cinnamon. These banquets also altered social dynamics. Access to the king became controlled. Invitations mattered. Seating reflected status. Favour was no longer earned solely through bravery or loyalty, but through proximity to court culture. Persian nobles navigated this world effortlessly. Macedonians stumbled, unsure of etiquette, resenting the shift. Alcohol, once a bond between king and men, became a danger. Alexander drank heavily, as he always had, but now within an environment that encouraged excess without restraint. Persian luxury removed the rough edges that had once limited indulgence. Drunken arguments escalated faster. Words spoken in silk halls carried political weight. Criticism grew quietly. Some Macedonians believed luxury was changing Alexander's character. Others feared it signaled moral decay, the classic conqueror's trap undone by comfort. Stories circulated, exaggerated with each telling, painting a picture of a king forgetting his roots. Alexander dismissed these fears. He believed indulgence did not equal weakness. Persian kings ruled vast empires while surrounded by luxury. Clearly, comfort had not made them powerless. He saw banquets as tools, stages where loyalty could be displayed, alliances reinforced, and hierarchy clarified. But excess has a way of revealing fault lines. The more Alexander participated in Persian spectacle, the more visible the gap became between ruler and companions. What Persians recognized as kingship, Macedonians increasingly saw as alien. The banquet table, once a place of unity, became another reminder that Alexander was no longer entirely theirs. Alexander's adoption of Persian luxury was not limited to clothing or ceremony. It extended into the most sensitive territory imaginable: marriage. In Macedonia, royal marriages were political, but they remained firmly within Greek aristocratic circles. Persia operated differently. Marriage was an imperial tool, binding families, regions, and loyalties into bloodlines that outlived campaigns. Alexander married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, early in his eastern campaigns. He claimed affection, and it may have been genuine, but the political meaning was unmistakable. This was not conquest through force. It was fusion. Later, Alexander went further. At Susa, he orchestrated mass marriages between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, presenting the unions as symbols of unity between conquerors and conquered. To Alexander, this was visionary. He believed empires survived when elites merged. Shared children meant shared futures. Macedonians would no longer rule Persia as outsiders, but as part of its aristocracy. Culture would blend naturally over generations. Macedonian officers were far less enthusiastic. Many viewed the marriages as coercive, awkward, or outright insulting. Persian women represented the very culture they had been taught to despise. Some complied out of loyalty. Others quietly resented being transformed into symbols rather than partners. A number of these marriages dissolved as soon as Alexander died, revealing how thin the commitment truly was. Persians, meanwhile, watched carefully. For them, marriage signaled legitimacy. A king who married Persian nobility accepted Persian rules of succession, honor, and obligation. Alexander was not merely wearing Persian robes, he was inserting himself into Persian dynastic logic. This frightened some Macedonians more than silk ever had. Marriage suggested permanence. It implied Alexander intended to stay, rule, and transform, rather than conquer and leave. The dream of returning home as victorious heroes faded. The empire was no longer a temporary occupation. It was becoming a shared world. Alexander underestimated the emotional weight of bloodlines. Cultural blending sounds noble in theory. In practice, it threatens identity. Macedonians feared dilution. Persians feared replacement. Alexander stood between them, convinced that his personal authority could hold it together. For a brief moment, it almost worked. Court life reflected a new elite, bilingual, bicultural, and loyal to Alexander alone. But unity built on one man's vision is fragile. When that man disappears, bloodlines remember their origins. Marriage was Alexander's boldest experiment in fusion. It was also the clearest sign that his conquest of Persia was no longer about territory. It was about creating something entirely new, whether his followers wanted it or not. As Alexander's court grew more Persian in appearance and behavior, resistance among the Macedonians hardened. At first it had been grumbling, quiet jokes about silk sleeves, uneasy laughter at court rituals, pointed silences during ceremonies. Over time, it became anger. Many veterans believed they were watching their king drift away from the values that had bound them together since youth. The problem was not just luxury, it was hierarchy. Macedonian identity was built on shared hardship. Officers expected access to the king, the right to speak freely, and the dignity of being treated as comrades rather than subjects. Persian court culture disrupted this entirely. Access became controlled. Protocol mattered. Favour felt less earned and more bestowed. Some Macedonians spoke openly. Others paid the price. The most famous rupture came with Clytus the Black, a trusted companion who had saved Alexander's life in battle. During a drunken banquet, Clytus accused Alexander of abandoning Macedonian ways and inflating his own divinity. He mocked Persian customs and reminded the king that his victories rested on Macedonian blood. Alexander, intoxicated and furious, killed him on the spot. The act shocked everyone, including Alexander himself. He reportedly collapsed in grief afterward, refusing food and condemning his own actions. But the damage was done. The incident became a warning. Dissent would no longer be tolerated lightly. Other officers learned the lesson. Criticism did not stop, it went underground. Loyalty remained, but it was strained and cautious. Macedonians continued to fight brilliantly for Alexander, yet something essential had shifted. Their king no longer felt fully reachable. Alexander interpreted resistance as misunderstanding rather than rebellion. He believed time would normalize the changes. Macedonians, he assumed, would eventually accept Persian customs once they saw the benefits of stable rule and shared power. What he underestimated was emotional inertia. Identity does not adapt at the speed of policy. For Persians, the tension confirmed Alexander's commitment. He was willing to alienate his own people to rule properly. That sacrifice earned respect. For Macedonians, it felt like betrayal. Change always has a cost. Alexander was willing to pay it, confident that his vision justified the strain. But empires are not held together by vision alone. They rely on trust, and trust frays when people feel replaced rather than included. By this point, Alexander stood at the center of a paradox. He was stronger than ever as an emperor and weaker than ever as a companion. The transformation that secured Persia had begun to hollow out the loyalty that once defined his rule. By the later years of his reign, Alexander had stopped trying to explain himself to the Macedonians. The debates were over. The experiments were complete. He no longer dressed Persian only on occasion. or adopted customs tentatively. He ruled openly as a king of Asia, a title that mattered far more to him than King of Macedonia ever had. This was not vanity. It was strategy, hardened into identity. Alexander had conquered too much territory to rule it as a Macedonian chieftain. The empire stretched across peoples who did not value blunt familiarity or warrior equality. They expected hierarchy, ceremony, and visible distance. A king who behaved like a drinking companion inspired confusion, not loyalty. Alexander adjusted accordingly. Court life became formalized. Audiences were regulated. Rank determined proximity. Persian administrators filled key roles alongside Macedonians, chosen for competence rather than shared history. The empire began to function less like an army on campaign and more like a permanent state. For Macedonian veterans, this was the final break. Many had expected conquest to end with reward and return. Instead, they found themselves aging inside an empire that no longer reflected their values. Their king still fought, still commanded brilliantly, but he no longer belonged exclusively to them. Alexander was aware of the alienation. He simply believed it was unavoidable. Empires, in his mind, required transformation. The conqueror had to change faster than those who followed, or risk being trapped by nostalgia. Macedonia was his origin, not his destination. Persians increasingly saw Alexander as legitimate. He honoured their traditions, upheld their elites, and ruled within their symbolic framework. To them, he was not a foreign occupier pretending to belong. He was a successor. This dual perception, alien to Macedonians, acceptable to Persians, defined Alexander's final years. He stood alone at the centre of a blended elite, convinced that history would vindicate him, even if his companions never fully did. What Alexander became was unprecedented. Not a Greek king ruling barbarians, not a Persian king born foreign. Something new, built deliberately and at great personal cost. His silk robes, diadems, ceremonies, and marriages were not indulgences. They were the architecture of an empire that existed only as long as he did. In choosing to become king of Asia, Alexander accepted isolation. He gained legitimacy over millions and lost intimacy with the few who had marched beside him from the beginning. Power expanded. Belonging narrowed. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Did you know? Long before modern globalization, Alexander's court functioned as one of history's earliest experiments in enforced cultural integration, proving that blending empires is far harder than conquering them. To Alexander's critics, Persian luxury was not merely foreign, it was dangerous. Greek and Macedonian tradition had long framed the East as soft, indulgent, and morally suspect. Persian wealth was believed to weaken discipline, blur judgment, and rot virtue from the inside. By adopting silk robes, perfumes, and elaborate court rituals, Alexander appeared to be stepping directly into this old warning tale. The fear was simple. Luxury corrupts. Macedonian veterans told themselves a familiar story. Persia had fallen because its kings grew soft, distracted by gold and comfort. Macedonia had triumphed because it was hard, hungry, and disciplined. Now their own king reclined on couches, surrounded by incense and ceremony. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. If Persia had lost its empire to excess, what would excess do to Alexander's? Alexander rejected this logic entirely. To him, luxury was not weakness, it was infrastructure. Persian systems had endured for centuries precisely because they invested in administration, symbolism, and elite loyalty. Silk did not make a man cowardly. Gold did not dull strategy. Only complacency did, and Alexander had no intention of becoming complacent. Yet perception mattered more than intent. Soldiers watched their king's lifestyle change while their own remained brutal. Campaigns continued. Marches grew longer. Death never retreated. The contrast between court splendor and military hardship bred resentment. Luxury at the top looked like distance, even indifference. Alexander tried to counter this by continuing to lead from the front, fighting in battles and enduring wounds. But identity is shaped by patterns, not exceptions. Each banquet, each ceremony, each Persian custom reinforced the sense that Alexander was becoming something other than what he had been. There was also fear of permanence. Luxury suggested settlement. Settlement suggested the end of shared struggle. The Macedonians had followed a war leader. Now they were serving an emperor. The difference was psychological and profound. Ironically, Persian elites viewed Alexander's luxury as restraint. He adopted only part of their court culture, discarding what he found excessive. To them, he was still surprisingly austere. This gap in perception widened misunderstanding on both sides. Luxury, then, became a mirror. Macedonians saw corruption, Persians saw legitimacy, Alexander saw necessity. What frightened his followers most was not silk or gold, but transformation without consensus. Alexander no longer asked permission to change. He assumed history would justify him. That confidence, more than luxury itself, unsettled those who remembered a king who once needed their approval as much as their swords. In the end, the debate over luxury was really a debate over identity, and Alexander had already chosen his. By the time Alexander reached the end of his life, the question was no longer whether he had adopted Persian luxury. That debate was settled. The real question was whether his experiment in cultural fusion could survive without him. The answer, revealed almost immediately after his death, was no. Alexander had built an empire held together by personal authority. Silk robes, diadems, Persian ceremonies, and blended elites all pointed back to one central figure who could embody contradiction without apology. He was Macedonian by blood, Persian by presentation, and imperial by ambition. As long as he lived, the system worked because he was the system. When he died, the illusion collapsed. Macedonian officers abandoned Persian dress almost overnight. Mass marriages dissolved. Court rituals vanished. Proskynesis disappeared without protest. The men who had tolerated Alexander's transformation suddenly felt free to reject it. They did not fight to preserve his cultural vision. They fought to carve the empire into familiar pieces. Persian elites, meanwhile, learned a harsh lesson. Alexander had promised continuity, but continuity depended entirely on his presence. Without him, Macedonian generals ruled as conquerors again, not successors. The blending Alexander worked so carefully to construct proved fragile because it had not yet become habit. This does not mean Alexander failed. His adoption of Persian luxury was not decadence. It was a deliberate attempt to solve an ancient problem: how to rule people who do not share your culture without ruling them forever at sword point. He understood that power had to look familiar to be accepted. He understood symbolism mattered as much as force. He simply ran out of time. Alexander's legacy is not found in silk robes or court rituals. It is found in the idea that conquest alone is insufficient. Empires must be lived in, not merely occupied. His willingness to shock his own people in order to stabilize a larger world was radical, even reckless, but visionary. To Macedonians, Alexander became too Persian. To Persians, he never became Persian enough. To history, he became something else entirely. His luxury shocked his companions because it signaled transformation, not weakness. It marked the moment when Alexander stopped being just a conqueror and attempted to become an emperor of cultures rather than territories. The tragedy is that the most ambitious part of his reign, the blending of worlds, was the least durable. It survived only as long as he breathed. And yet, for a brief moment, silk and steel shared the same throne. Ancient Egyptian clothing began with a simple, unavoidable reality: the heat. The Nile Valley was bright, humid, and relentlessly hot for much of the year, and fashion evolved as a response to survival before it ever became an expression of beauty. Linen made from flax was not chosen because it looked elegant, though it often did, but because it worked better than almost anything else available. It allowed air to circulate, dried quickly after washing, and remained tolerable against the skin under a brutal sun. Flax cultivation was widespread along the Nile, and linen production became both a domestic skill and a state-controlled industry. Spinning, weaving, bleaching and cutting were labour-intensive processes, and the quality of the final cloth mattered deeply. Linen could range from rough and heavy to astonishingly fine, woven so thin it appeared nearly transparent. This variation turned fabric into a social language. The body might be dressed simply, but the cloth itself quietly announced status. Most Egyptians wore minimal garments: loincloths, short kilts for men, and wrapped dresses or sheath garments for women. These designs changed little over centuries because they were practical and effective. Excess fabric trapped heat. Structure restricted movement. Simplicity was efficiency. Clothing was wrapped, tied, and adjusted rather than stitched into complex shapes, allowing flexibility in both comfort and appearance. Cleanliness elevated linen beyond practicality into moral significance. White clothing symbolized purity, order, and harmony with the gods. Dirt was not merely unpleasant, it was associated with chaos. As a result, garments were washed frequently, sometimes daily, and bleached under the sun until they regained brightness. To appear in public with stained or rumpled clothing suggested disorder in both household and soul. Whiteness also signalled privilege. Keeping linen clean required water, labour, and time. Those who worked in fields or construction could not maintain pristine garments. Their linen was thicker, darker, and visibly worn. Elites, priests, and officials appeared in crisp white, reinforcing the connection between cleanliness and authority. In Egyptian society, clothing did not aim to conceal the body or reshape it dramatically. Instead, it framed the human form with clarity and restraint. Linen acted as climate control, social marker, and religious statement all at once. What looked simple was anything but. Every fold, knot, and brightness level communicated how a person lived, worked, and stood within the ordered world the Egyptians believed they were meant to maintain. In ancient Egypt, clothing alone did not define appearance. The body itself was treated as part of fashion, hygiene, and spiritual order. Heat, insects, and ritual purity all pushed Egyptians toward an aesthetic that modern eyes often mistake for vanity, but was rooted in practicality. Bare skin was not scandalous, it was efficient. Most Egyptians removed body hair regularly. Heads were shaved smooth, especially among priests, who saw hair as a potential source of impurity. Lice thrived in warm climates, and shaving was the simplest defense. Clean skin meant fewer parasites, less sweat trapped against the body, and a clearer sense of order. Wigs were worn not to hide baldness, but to control when and how hair appeared in public. Hair became optional, removable, and situational. The ideal Egyptian body was slim, youthful, and symmetrical. Clothing emphasized this rather than obscuring it. Linen clung lightly, outlining form without constriction. For men, short kilts highlighted the waist and legs. For women, sheath dresses followed the line of the body, suspended by thin straps. The body was not something to be hidden. It was something to be maintained. Skincare was inseparable from clothing. Oils and unguents were applied daily to protect against sun and dryness. These substances softened skin, repelled insects, and carried pleasant scents. Scent itself was a form of cleanliness. To smell good suggested health, status, and divine favour. Poorer Egyptians used animal fats mixed with herbs. Elites accessed imported resins and perfumes. Nudity, especially among children, was common and unremarkable. Infants and young children often wore nothing at all, as clothing would have been unnecessary and uncomfortable. This changed gradually, with age and status, not with moral judgment. The body was natural. Disorder was not. Priests followed the strictest standards. Before entering temples, they bathed multiple times a day, shaved completely, and wore fresh linen. Their appearance mirrored the controlled perfection of the gods they served. Any deviation, dirt, hair, odour, disrupted ritual balance. Egyptian fashion was not about layering or concealment. It was about alignment, body, garment, scent, and cleanliness working together. Shaved skin, oiled limbs, and light linen created a unified presentation of order in a world where chaos was always a threat. To maintain the body properly was to participate in maintaining the universe itself. Cosmetics in ancient Egypt were never trivial. Kohl-lined eyes, vivid pigments, and carefully prepared pastes were used by men, women, and children alike. Far from being decorative excess, eye makeup served medical, magical, and social functions simultaneously. To line the eyes was to protect them, to beautify them, and to align oneself with divine forces. Kohl was typically made from ground minerals such as galena or malachite, mixed with oils or fats to create a smooth paste. Applied around the eyes, it reduced glare from the sun, helped repel insects, and may have offered some antibacterial protection. In a land of bright light and blowing sand, eye care was not optional. It was daily maintenance. The shape of Kohl application mattered. Extended lines mimicked the Eye of Horus, a powerful symbol of protection, healing, and divine order. To paint one's eyes this way was to carry a god's safeguard on the face. Makeup functioned as a portable amulet, worn openly rather than hidden. Even statues and mummies were given painted eyes, ensuring protection extended into the afterlife. Colour carried meaning. Green, associated with malachite, symbolized growth, fertility, and rebirth. Black represented stability, regeneration, and the fertile Nile soil itself. These were not aesthetic choices made on impulse. Pigments were selected intentionally, layered with meaning understood across society. Cosmetics containers reflected status. Simple reed or clay pots served ordinary households. Elites used alabaster jars, carved stone palettes, and finely crafted applicators. Possessing cosmetics signaled care, wealth, and self-respect. Neglecting appearance suggested disorder or mourning. Makeup was applied daily, not saved for ceremony. It marked participation in civilized life. The face presented to others was the face presented to the gods. To appear unadorned was to appear unfinished. There were risks. Some mineral ingredients were toxic in high quantities. Long-term exposure may have caused irritation or poisoning, though the Egyptians likely balanced these dangers against perceived benefits. Protection mattered more than caution. Kohl blurred boundaries between medicine, magic, and fashion, because those boundaries did not exist in Egyptian thought. Health was spiritual, beauty was functional, cosmetics were tools. In lining their eyes, Egyptians were not trying to impress. They were reinforcing order, shielding the body, and signaling belonging in a world where appearance carried cosmic weight. Every darkened eyelid was both practical defense and quiet prayer, painted carefully each morning before facing the sun. One of the most puzzling elements of ancient Egyptian fashion is the cone of scented fat often shown perched on heads in tomb paintings. For a long time, scholars debated whether these cones were symbolic or real. Evidence now suggests they were very real, very fragrant, and very intentional. These cones were not accessories in the modern sense. They were wearable scent delivery systems. The cones were made from animal fat or wax infused with perfumes, resins, and aromatic oils. Placed on the head, they slowly melted in the heat, releasing fragrance over hours. As the fat softened, scented oils trickled down the hair, neck, and clothing, layering the wearer in scent. This was not subtle. It was immersive. Scent mattered deeply in Egyptian culture. Pleasant smells were associated with purity, life, and the gods. Foul odours were linked to decay, chaos, and evil. To smell good was to be morally aligned with order. Perfume was not luxury, it was correctness. Scent cones appeared most often during festivals, banquets, and religious ceremonies. These were moments when human and divine realms were believed to draw closer. Wearing a cone signalled participation in ritual time rather than ordinary life. It marked celebration, abundance, and divine favour. Not everyone wore them daily. The ingredients were costly, and cones were messy. They stained clothing and required maintenance. This limitation turned them into status objects. The ability to smell continuously of imported resins and oils signaled wealth and access to trade networks stretching deep into Africa and the Near East. The sensory experience of Egyptian fashion was complete. Linen cooled the skin. Oils protected it. Cosmetics shielded the eyes. Scents enveloped the body. Clothing alone was only one layer in a system designed to regulate the body and present it properly to gods and people alike. The melting cone also reflected Egyptian attitudes toward time and transformation. As the cone dissolved, fragrance spread. What began solid became invisible yet present. This mirrored religious beliefs about offerings, decay,